Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. Today's session is called Caribou Habitat Restoration, Legacy Seismic Line Restoration in Alberta. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to recognize the traditional Indigenous lands where Eco-Canada's office is based in Calgary. At Eco-Canada, we're committed to working towards respectful acknowledgement, collaboration, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples across Canada. This starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to live and work within the Treaty 7 territory. Today, we are presenting from the City of Calgary, home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We would also like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Niitsitapi, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda, which include Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. My name is Danielle Fisher, and I'm the Lead Event Manager for Eco-Canada, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping guidelines for today's session to ensure that everyone can enjoy and participate in the webinar effectively. All participants are muted, so please check your audio settings to ensure that you can hear us properly. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the question box and select Eco-Canada, the organizer, and I will do all that I can to resolve the issue. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand to you within the next 24 hours. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email with a link to the video. Any questions that you have about the presentation or today's topic can be submitted through the chat box or question box. We will have dedicated time after the presentation to answer any questions from the audience. Finally, we really want to know what you think about our webinars and how we can keep improving. You'll be sent a short survey after the webinar ends. Please let us know what you think or if you have any comments or suggestions about the webinar. Eco-Canada's vision is to build the world's leading environmental workforce. Eco-Canada seeks to help environmental workers succeed at each step of their career journey. To do this, Eco-Canada has developed programs tailored to individuals at different stages of their career. For those looking to enter the environmental workforce, Eco-Canada provides training through the BEAR program and accreditation for environmental programs at post-secondary institutions. Eco-Canada also provides opportunities for new workers to break into the environmental sector through wage funding for co-op students and recent post-secondary graduates. For those already employed as environmental workers, Eco-Canada provides the environmental professional and environmental professional in training certifications. Lastly, Eco-Canada provides opportunities for those with vast experience as environmental workers to provide guidance and direction to Eco-Canada's products and programs through advisory committee and emeritus membership. Without further ado, I will now introduce our wonderful presenters today. First up, we have Scott Wilson. Scott is a senior environmental analyst with Silvacom's Energy and Environment Group. He partakes in the statistical analysis, reporting, stakeholder engagement, and project management of various projects for industrial and governmental clients. Next, we have Katie Lemeroux. Katie is a resource analyst and registered professional forester with Silvacom's Energy and Environment team. Over the last 5 years, she has been involved in all aspects of linear restoration projects across Alberta. Now I'll be handing it over to Scott. There you go, Scott.
Are we seeing the screen?
We can see the whole screen.
Yep.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Danielle, and going through the housekeeping stuff. And thanks to Eco-Canada for having us. And as Danielle mentioned, I'm here with Katie, and we're going to talk about caribou habitat restoration, specifically the legacy seismic line restoration in Alberta. So, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about, oh goodness, how do I minimize this thing? Sorry about that. So we'll talk about who Silvacom is, why are we presenting on this topic, get into a little bit about what linear features we're talking about, where did they come from, why are we worried about them, then talk about how linear restoration can be used as a tool in that realm. Katie will talk about linear restoration in action, so what happens on the ground, what do we actually do? And then we'll get into some of the challenges and some of the successes that we've seen and experienced it on the ground working on these types of projects, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So Silvacom was established in 1983, and basically we understand the complexity and challenge of forestry operations and how to successfully deploy technology in a productive and cost-effective fashion. So Danielle mentioned that we're in the energy and environment groups, so we're environmental professionals and forestry professionals. We have a whole group of forestry professionals and then a whole group of application development services, remote sensing, all sorts of things to help folks with different landscape management problems. Our head office is in Edmonton, but we've got an office in Calgary. We just recently opened up a new office in Thunder Bay, and then we've got folks working remotely across the country. So one of our main areas of work is in the whole company is natural resource management and consulting, which includes stuff like forest management planning, environmental monitoring, landscape planning, biomass assessments, carbon accounting, wildfire management, but we're here specifically to talk about linear restoration. We've worked on planning, analysis, implementation, monitoring, and research in several Caribou ranges in Alberta. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to pause to take sips of tea once in a while. I've got a bit of a cough going on. We return to these regions, some of these regions every year to do monitoring or more research on a yearly basis, or if we've got projects going on working on the implementation. So we've been to some of these areas a number of different times. And we'll talk a little bit more about everything that goes into these different types of projects I mentioned, planning and implementation and everything like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So now we want to talk about the title of the talk is linear restoration on legacy seismic lines. So we're going to look at what seismic lines look like, where do they come from, why are they a problem, and so on. So first we'll talk about caribou. Caribou are medium-sized ungulates. They're built for the muskeg and snow. Their life cycle is they breed in the fall, born in the spring, and they have a very low productive potential. Females are 3 years old before they can start breeding, and they only have one calf per pregnancy. So there's declining populations in most ranges. Caribou avoid human land use activities, and that can cause them to cluster a little bit more than they'd naturally be, which does not allow them to maintain their low and distributed population densities that they normally would. There's a bunch of other limiting factors, either directly or indirectly from human activities and developments, which means that there are opportunities to manage and reduce the effects of those human-caused factors. So we pulled an image from Google Maps online just to show some of the different disturbance types in Alberta. And this is a really good one showing a lot of those seismic lines. So you can see some roads and a couple of well site pads, but there are a lot of straight, long, and intersecting seismic lines. It's estimated that there's over 250,000 kilometers of seismic lines in caribou ranges in Alberta. And many of those lines are not growing back. When they originally cut the lines, they assumed that they would grow back, but because of compaction, regular human and animal use of the lines, and other factors, many of them are not growing back. And this is a problem for caribou. One of the dominant theories behind a source of caribou decline is the ease and speed with which predators like wolves can move along these linear disturbances, these seismic lines, to access areas in search. They'd normally be looking for deer and moose. They're more common targets, and then they end up with some incidental caribou contact, and that's happening at higher rates than if these lines did not exist. So seismic lines cut through the landscape and often go through multiple ecosite types in just a few hundred meters. So while predators may not normally spend time, or may normally spend time in for example, the upland area on the left with those deciduous looking trees, the seismic lines give them a straightforward path. We call them highways to the lowland area where it might be preferential habitat for the caribou. So seismic lines themselves are used to find oil reserves underground. Nowadays, low impact seismic lines are about 1 to 1.5 meters wide and move back and forth across the forest. But half a century ago, the seismic lines were cut wide with heavy equipment in straight lines, and usually they were usually between about 5 and 10 meters. So what would happen is using locations on several of the lines, electrical pulses would be sent into the ground and bounce back and give identify pockets of oil. So that's why these things were made, is just to try and find oil underground. Again, no one had to reclaim these seismic lines because everyone assumed that they would grow back. Unfortunately, mostly they didn't. Under Canada's Species at Risk Act, each province and territory has to develop plans for caribou population recovery, and one management tool that's being used is habitat restoration with a focus on restoring these linear features, these seismic lines. So now we'll talk a little bit about how linear restoration can be used to mitigate the problem that we're facing. Some of the resources for helping to recover caribou populations and habitat. What are the legislative directions? What are the goals? How are they being measured? Who's participating? And how does this align with linear restoration in action? So the federal government stepped in, as I mentioned, to demand action and planning on the threatened woodland caribou. And provincial governments are responding with plans. Before and while this is happening, some grassroots industry-led initiatives were happening, like a project that we've been involved with near Fort McMurray called Algar in the 2010s. I think it started in 2011 with partnerships from a formal group of handful of oil and gas companies. We did some planning and implementation of linear restoration on those lines, and I'll show some pictures of that later because those projects are pretty old now, relatively speaking, in this field. Now there's a lot of government-funded projects and pilots going on, most of which right now are happening in Alberta and Little Smoky. And there are a lot of tools in play for caribou recovery. You can see here there's conservation areas, rearing facilities, engaging Indigenous peoples and other folks. But the main target has been linear restoration, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is, other than the problem that we talked about, it being one of the main reasons why caribou populations are decreasing. So here's just a talk about some of the different policies and guiding documents for caribou habitat restoration. I'm sorry, I've got a baby I can hear crying upstairs. I think my wife's just leaving the house right now, and the baby's probably in the car seat. The Alberta draft provincial woodland caribou range plan identifies 150,000 kilometers of legacy seismic lines that may require treatment. So we talked about 250,000 kilometers earlier, and I think this plan just identified the ones that are likely to require treatment. Importantly, the Section 11 agreement between the provincial and federal government, which is a commitment to continue to implement and scale up the provincial restoration program. And then there's this draft document, the framework for the provincial restoration and establishment framework for legacy seismic lines in Alberta. It's a practical guide that's gone through a few revisions and continue to be worked on using learnings from the real world implementation. The guide, the draft restoration framework, provides guidance and techniques for ensuring the quality and impact of restoration efforts through all 5 identified phases of linear restoration. So it talks about timing, tree planting objectives, so like the density and heights that the trees have to be for at different ages after planting, which trees are acceptable, how to conduct the quality control, and more. So it's a really useful guide when we're working on these linear restoration projects. So because of its prevalence on the landscape, restoring seismic lines is the management tool with the greatest opportunity to increase undisturbed caribou habitat and help achieve our disturbance targets and help the caribou habitat. So it's a significant long-term investment that the government's working on now. Linear restoration can be expensive, and it takes a long time for these lines to fully recover. To really realize the goals and get some cost efficiencies, there's a need to scale up, and that's been happening a little bit more in the last few years, going from doing a handful of kilometers every year to doing hundreds of kilometers a year. And there's a lot of different considerations that need to be taken into account during the program design. Seasonal access, existing natural regeneration, so places you might not have to restore because they're already starting to grow back. What are the forestry companies going to be doing there? Are they going to go cut a line after we've restored it? Current and future oil and gas development, planning around that, and then current use, specifically around recreation and trappers. Traditional use are there folks that are in there that need those lines to access places they've been going for a long time. So here's just a high-level summary of what goes into linear restoration projects. There's the planning, so where to go, where to start, where are we going to start the actual implementation of the linear restoration, how do we treat it? Katie's going to talk a little bit more about that stuff. Scouting, so getting out there to confirm some of the calls that were made in the planning portion, making adjustments and checking out for water crossings and things like that. Then there's permissions, so need to get road use permission from different companies if they own the roads that access some of these areas. Stakeholder engagement from industry operating in the area I talked about, and then trappers, obviously we need to get they're okay to go to these lines as well. And then implementation, and that's what Katie's going to go over, is the actual prep and planting of the lines, and then quality control. So I had a slide a little while back about the different timing of the quality control that has to happen. So there's a survival assessments, and then later on around year 8 through 10, there's establishment surveys just to make sure the lines are on track. So now I'll hand it over to Katie, and she's going to talk us through linear restoration in action a little bit.
Thanks. So some of the objectives of linear restoration are really, well, the objectives of linear restoration are really tied to the limiting factors of the actual sites, and those can be really specific, and there can be many of them on the same site. So some limiting factors include recreational accessibility, the distance that can be seen down the line by humans and predators, other predators. Soil compaction is a big one, from the heavy machines that built the lines, but also from recreational use or industrial use. You also might need to maintain access for the trappers in the area, and wet soils are a significant part of linear restoration limiting factors. In the next slide, you can see I listed a few limiting factors and a possible solution for each. Wet soils can be mounded so that there's a site available for a seedling to grow. Site preparation happens to loosen the soils so that the seedlings can grow as well. You can see that happening on the far right with the machine. And blocking off views, you'll see in a bunch of pictures that's one of the goals of linear restoration as well in the short term, is to block the view while the trees are growing, to do the blocking of the view later. You'll often need multiple solutions for the same chunk of line, like I mentioned before. This photo just demonstrates that wet sites are mounded. So we usually use an excavator that takes a scoop of the soil and flips it upside down. This provides distance for the seedling from the water, so the seedlings are planted closer to the top so they don't drown eventually. And a mound is an overturned bucket of the muskeg next to the hole. So this also restricts access because it's a little treacherous to walk through. It's easier to walk through the forest, personal experience. And the moss underneath of the mound can also contribute to nutrient availability as it decays. In the next slide, you'll see dry sites are screefed. So essentially the teeth on the bucket there are different ways to do this, but the teeth on the bucket in this picture are scraping the soil a few inches down, and this can loosen some seed source. It also allows planters to put seedlings in the ground where the soil would have been rock hard before. And yeah, I guess it's a pretty simple concept, that one. Sites without natural regeneration are planted. So sometimes this is directly, sometimes this is after site preparation. We've done it in both the winter and the summer. In the winter, you have different problems than you do in the summer. For example, your unbundling of the trees needs to be really careful so that you don't break them in the winter. And it can be difficult for the planters to plant if the soil freezes with lots of moisture in it. And summer planting usually means accessing a site after it was site prepped in the winter, which, as you can imagine, one of the goals being to block access can be quite a challenge. And in the next slide, this is what I was talking about before. In the short term, you're blocking sight lines and physical access. Like you can't drive over these piles by creating large blinds out of the trees from the forest along the seismic line. They add nutrients, they add seeds, and it just looks unpleasant to travel down, which is great. Like even if you were right in front of the blind and you could see a place to go around, in theory, looking down it from a kilometer away, it does not look accessible by humans or wildlife. So they serve that purpose as well. And I'll hand it back to Scott for some more details on our projects.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so I'm going to chat a little bit more about some of the challenges and show some pictures of some of the stuff that hasn't worked out as well, and then talk about some of the successes that we've seen. And at the end, I have a recent report that came out, an article in a journal that that kind of shows that what we're doing appears to be working. So some good news. So some of the main challenges we identified, and Katie kind of touched on, is working in wet areas. So there's a couple things with it. It just makes it more challenging for the trees to grow in these wet areas because they've been compacted by big machines. So the lines aren't at the level of the water table that they might normally be, and these trees in these areas are very slow growing in the first place. And then there's the cost. We talked about how costly it is to do this work, accessibility. So a lot of these seismic lines are in middle of nowhere, basically. So there's no road access. So you're using seismic lines to get to seismic lines, things like that. And then there's seasonal timing limitations. So we talk about doing some of the work in winter. For that to be done with some of the bigger machines, the ground needs to be quite frozen. So there might only be a couple months where that's working out. If you get a warm snap, it could cause problems. And then there's timing around when the caribou are going to be around. So there's limitations of when you can be doing work in the area. And then there's always the issue of we're doing all this work, we're spending all this money, and there's an uncertainty around the long-term impact of linear restoration. But like I said, we have some good news around that. So just a little bit more about the wet areas. Here's some of the sites that we've worked on and been at. On the left-hand side is just kind of a tamarack, black spruce looking forest that would have been mounded and planted, and you're not really seeing too many more mounds. It just makes growing the trees a challenge. The background photo here shows obviously an area that was treated. You can see the little holes and that's water in those. So it shows how close the line is to the water table. So it would have been mounded, and we're not seeing any trees. So the mounds themselves would have been washed away, either rain or just the water moving through the fen. And so the vegetation that's taking over is, grasses, sedges, alder, and other shrubs, and they've kind of taken over a little bit. And a lot of these sites do still have some trees, but they're struggling to compete with the other vegetation, and that slows the recovery speed of these sections of lines. The photo on the right is one in kind of a boggy area, and the grasses have just taken over, and the alder. And I know I've been to that site, and there are trees there, but they're all hidden underneath, and they're taking a while to recover. It's been a few years since I've been there, so who knows? Maybe they're reaching up to the alder height now. We talk about the costs of doing this. So linear restoration is expensive. Even without getting into the planning and the quality control and the actual implementation. So what Katie showed pictures of, so the digging, the screefing, tree felling, planting, all that kind of stuff, costs over $10,000 a kilometer. So everything depends heavily on the accessibility, the terrain, and several other factors that can really vary the costs. But you can see pictures of all the different types of machines that are out there working. Sometimes helicopters are required to bring in trees or planters themselves. We've got the background photo there is showing some work done using rig mats to help the machines move along the line safely and not mess things up too much. So yeah, there's a lot of different work that goes into this linear restoration. It's not just as simple as hiring some planters and asking them to go plant trees down a line. That wouldn't always work that great. Accessibility challenge. So the background photo here is a really steep slope, and that's just challenging to work on. And then we've just got some more images of the accessibility required. So you need rig mats to get over water, or you need helicopters to fly in trees. And then the photo on the right is a tree planter working in a really wet area and just trying to walk around there. You wouldn't be able to get a quad down there at all. So now we'll just take a look at some of our successes. So meeting our objectives. Like we talked about, scaling up is really important. So when we first started this, we were doing a handful of kilometers every year, and now it's really scaled up to doing, hundreds. There's a lot of innovation, so different types of implementation, monitoring, and research that's been going on over the last decade, using some of those earlier restoration projects. And then there's public awareness, and we've done a few survival assessments that have worked out pretty well. So I talked about a project that we started in 2011 that's up near Fort McMurray, the Algar project. So on the left-hand side, you can see in 2011, excuse me, when they'd been doing some the initial scouting, to looking at the line. You can see there's no trees on that line, and that line would have been created sometime in the 90s, I think. So nothing growing after 20 years. In 2012, it was planted, and you can see over the years, by 2018, we've got trees that are, that year I remember we went out and there was trees that were over 1 meter tall, which is a great news story for that project and for the work that we're doing out there. Same kind of thing, same project, different set of lines. So we were out there in different years, and you can see the trees really starting to come in. And this one was mounded, so you see the trees growing on the mounds there over time from 2012 through 2019. And then I talked about the challenge of wet areas. Well, I wanted also to show some of the successes. So on the left-hand side and the right-hand side are some of the same lines that we were looking at before, where there was nothing growing, and now we've got a lot of trees coming up. So it's just a matter of maybe the water table height or something like that that makes it more challenging for some of the other trees to come up. And that's just a learning that we've been working on, and we've been doing some research to figure out what better tools could be used and what different objectives might be more appropriate for some of these types of conditions. The second from the left, the photo second from the left, is another one where the mounds are really working. Those trees are growing great on the mounds, and then there are some seeds that have come in, some seedlings that have come in just off the mounds as well. So the trees are coming up, and it looks like they're going to continue growing. Yeah, and then I wanted to talk about this this paper that was published in Conservation Biology in September. And basically, as you can see in the article impact statement, restoration treatments slows wolves, bears, and caribous by 23 to 40%. So it's addressing that key mechanism that I talked about earlier. The predominant theory of caribou decline is that, wolves and other predators are accessing these lines and moving really quickly down them. It looks like linear restoration, these projects are starting to work as far as slowing them down. Still a lot to learn and find out, but that's a really good news story about the linear restoration. So now that's about all we had to talk about as far as the presentation itself, but we can stick around. I know we've got lots of time left over for Q&A, and then I've also got one or two other slides that we could look at as just images if anyone's curious about them. So yeah, we can open it up for questions, and we just want to thank everyone for making time to come and listen to our webinar today. Yeah, if you want to reach out, you can go check out the Silvacom website. I'm available at scott.wilson@silvacom.com, and Katie's at katie.lamoureux@silvacom.com. And we've
Wonderful
got,
presentation, guys. Thank you so much. I'll hand it back over to you in a second here, Scott. I just wanted to let anyone know that if they wanted to ask any questions, please let them come through in the chat or the question segment in your dashboard. But I'll hand it back over to Scott to tell us all about this link on this last slide here.
sure, yeah, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, the link you see here takes you to a set of blogs that we have at the Silvicom website, and there are a bunch about linear restoration, but then we've got, you can learn a little bit more about, wildfire management, biomass assessments, ecosystem service, all sorts of things that we have going on at Silvicom.
Great. Joy Sherlock is asking, any chance attendees can get an access to that journal article that you were speaking about earlier?
So I don't have the rights to the article, but I'd be happy to share, where I found it or anything like that. It's open access, so you can read it. Yeah, it's just a conservation biology, and the paper is evaluating the impact of caribou habitat restoration on predator and prey movement.
Great. Anna has a question for you. She says, Scott, you spoke about challenges in line restoration and mentioned wet areas challenging for seedling establishment and the subsequent use of mounding techniques to get around this. Has there been any consideration when establishing restoration goals that expand past wildlife alone, such as the value of these wet peatland ecosystems and attached flora communities in regards to carbon storage, especially with growing concerns surrounding climate change? And she has an add-on question to that, but we'll start there.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and there's starting to be more talk about, the other considerations about what's going on the line. So when the stuff all started, it was, let's focus on how do we fix these lines for the caribou habitat. Like, first of all, it was like, what's the problem? What's going on with caribou? And this is, again, the predominant theory was that predators were getting down and easily accessing where the caribou were. So yeah, then starting to talk about, there's water table issues, there's soil issues, there's, like you mentioned, carbon to consider. So yes, all these things are kind of ongoing. I think, especially from a research perspective, as far as what the government is doing, and so they're the ones mainly funding this type of stuff. They're mainly just looking at what their goal is to restore the caribou habitat, and that's the main consideration at this point. Optimistically, restoring the lines and planting the trees are growing and helping with some of the carbon retention, but yeah, the peat being flipped over and stuff like that is obviously something to think about.
She goes on to ask, are there ever concerns with prioritizing tree planting and establishment over more longer-term goals and reestablishing the carbon accumulating peat systems that existed before line disturbance in these areas?
Yeah, I guess the same kind of answer. It's that's not the main consideration by these folks at this point. It's all about the caribou habitat restoration. So
yeah,
but those are great points, and given the opportunity, I think researchers or even folks like us would look at that kind of stuff. So it sounds like this is somebody that might be really interested in that field, which would be great to hear more about, and I'd be happy to chat about it. So
that would be wonderful. I can certainly set you guys up after the presentation.
that'd be great.
Jordan?
I was just thinking it might be valuable to mention that a lot of the linear restoration funding comes out of the FRIA Caribou Habitat Restoration Program. So the program is specific to Caribou Habitat
Mhm.
that provides the funding.
And for
Okay.
those who don't know, FRIA is, what's the acronym actually stand for, Katie?
The
Forest
Forest Resource
Resource.
Improvement Association of Alberta.
Yeah, so it's
Perfect.
forestry companies that put dollars in to do improvement in forestry, and they have a big bucket right now for caribou habitat restoration.
The Caribou
Great.
Habitat restoration money also is significantly funded by the government of Alberta,
Okay.
and it's administered through FRIA.
Great. Great. Lots of opportunity, it sounds like there. We have another question from Jordan. In several operational plans for this type of work, there's always a focus on reducing costs and new implementation techniques. Some techniques include drone planting and hummock transfer technique. Do you have any experience with these techniques and how effective they are?
So not specifically with the drone technique. We've had drones fly lines to do some analysis and understand what's going on the lines a little bit better, get some different imagery options other than like the helicopters are able to do. And then the hummock transfer technique is a very interesting one. So it's kind of an alternative to digging the holes and mounds on the line. For those that don't know, you're kind of trying to pick up just a little bit of the top part of the soil adjacent to the line and transfer it onto the line. So you're not tearing everything out, and you're keeping some of that root structure and maybe a tree or some shrubs in there, with the idea being that those are already established and they'll start growing on the line, and then they'll be a little bit higher up as well.
Great.
Excuse